You think you know your family. You think you know the boundaries of human history, of genetics, of love and loyalty. But some families carry secrets so deep, so twisted, that even time itself seems to shiver at their revelation. Imagine a family line stretching back 10 generations, where every whispered truth, every hidden desire defied not just societal norms, but the very biology that defines us. Imagine the weight of knowing that the blood running through your veins carries echoes of choices that should never have been made. Choices that left scars not just on flesh, but on the very essence of humanity. This is not a story told in history books, nor in dusty newspapers. This is a story buried in private journals, in letters that were never meant to be read, in graves carefully hidden behind white picket fences and perfectly manicured lawns. And yet, here it is, waiting for someone to bear witness. Some say the past has no voice, but the past in this family speaks, quietly, insistently, dragging the present down into shadows it cannot escape. You are about to step into a lineage where love was warped, where loyalty became a chain, where every generation compounded the sins of the last. And as you listen, consider this. What would it feel like to discover that your ancestors' most intimate decisions left a mark not just on history, but on the very blueprint of life that made you? Somewhere in the hollows of small-town America, hidden beneath ordinary streets, behind closed doors, a family existed that refused to follow the natural order. They refused, and the consequences were written not in headlines, but in the eyes of children, in the fragile bodies of those born into secrets. The story begins quietly, deceptively. A diary entry here, a strange remark there, a photograph that seems ordinary until you look closer, and then the horror of pattern emerges. 10 generations of choices, repeated and reinforced, as if the family itself were a dark experiment in the limits of human nature. By the time their truth would finally surface, it would leave a mark on anyone who dared to confront it, that they could never forget. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. It began with whispers. In a town that seemed ordinary to outsiders, the family stood out not for wealth or for notoriety, but for the sense that something was off. Neighbors would tell small stories in hushed tones, strange marriages, children who looked remarkably alike, illnesses that seemed to run not in any ordinary pattern. And at first these were easy to dismiss, chalked up to coincidence or small-town gossip. But the deeper you look, the more you see that coincidence has a limit, and this family had long ago exceeded it. Each generation, carefully controlled, carefully curated, was like a chapter in a private experiment. Children were born, but not as nature intended. Each life carried the imprint of previous transgressions, of choices made in shadowed rooms, decisions that should have ended in disaster, yet somehow persisted. Doctors and scientists would have called it dangerous, unnatural, a living cautionary tale about the limits of human reproduction. But the family had its own rules, its own code, one that placed loyalty to blood above all else. Marriages were arranged not for love, not for convenience, but to consolidate what they believed was strength, their DNA, their lineage, their secret. And with each passing generation, the consequences became more visible, more insidious. Eyes, gestures, ailments, behaviors, all whispered the same forbidden truth. This was not just a family, it was a living experiment in defiance of nature itself. Yet, to the outside world, everything appeared ordinary. School photos, birthday parties, church gatherings, a life carefully performed to hide the underlying horror. But history has a way of surfacing, of revealing what was meant to remain buried. Letters tucked into drawers, journals hidden in attics, even the careful words of distant relatives, all became evidence of a pattern that was too precise, too deliberate to be ignored. By the time an outsider could begin to connect the dots, the damage was already written in human lives, in fragile bodies that bore the consequences of repeated transgressions. And this is where the story turns darkest, not in some distant past, but in the present, in the way the family's secrets seeped into every corner of their lives, leaving an imprint of fear, shame, and something else, something far deeper. Something that makes you question the boundaries of morality, of biology, of what it means to be human. Because in this family, those boundaries were not just blurred, they were obliterated. By the third generation, the patterns were unmistakable. Anyone studying the family from the outside would have noticed the repetition. The same facial features cropping up with eerie precision, the same mannerisms, the same illnesses. But inside the household, these traits were normalized, even celebrated. What outsiders would call tragedy, the family called legacy. The walls of their home seemed to hum with the weight of expectation, a silent insistence that the next generation must preserve what had been preserved before. And yet, beneath this careful veneer there was tension, a quiet, knowing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong. Children grew up under the gaze of secrets too heavy to articulate, their identities shaped by choices they did not understand. Some tried to escape, but the pull of family of blood was nearly impossible to resist, and the psychological consequences were as cruel as the biological ones. Anxiety, paranoia, and a strange hyper-awareness haunted every member. No one could trust love or friendship outside the family, for they knew the world could not understand, and worse, the family itself demanded conformity. The adults in the lineage bore the responsibility of orchestrating the marriages, monitoring relationships, and ensuring that the pattern persisted. There was a perverse sense of duty, a belief that the family's survival depended on adherence to rules that defied nature itself. And so, the cycle continued. Each generation's triumphs and failures were recorded in hidden diaries, in letters never meant for the world, in photographs that seemed innocent until you studied them closely. And in these documents, the truth began to emerge, not just a story of love and marriage, but of obsession and control, of an obsession that spanned lifetimes. Every name, every birth date, every choice was part of a web so intricate it bordered on the pathological. And yet, as horrifying as these revelations are, they are not the worst. The worst comes when you realize that the family's actions did not simply stop at the consequences visible to the naked eye. Their defiance of biology carried a deeper, more sinister effect on the mind, on behavior, on the very way generations experience the world. It is one thing to inherit a surname. It is another to inherit a history of defiance that seeps into your DNA, your instincts, your perceptions. And this is where the family's secret becomes unbearable. They did not simply defy the rules of society. They defied the rules written into our very bodies, and in doing so, created a chain that no one, not even the most curious outsider, could easily break. By the fifth generation, the consequences of these decisions became undeniable. Physical traits were no longer subtle. They were pronounced, almost grotesque in their repetition. Children were born with inherited vulnerabilities, illnesses that echoed through the bloodline like a curse. But it wasn't only the body that suffered. The mind, too, carried the invisible weight of generations of secrecy, of choices that should never have been made. Anxiety, obsessive behavior, sudden bouts of aggression. These were not accidents. They were the fingerprints of a lineage that had tampered with the natural order. And yet the family remained remarkably cohesive. On the outside they appeared ordinary, even charming. They attended church, hosted holiday dinners, smiled for photographs. But behind closed doors, their world was a pressure cooker of suppressed truths, whispered instructions, and unspoken rules. Every decision, every relationship, was measured against an invisible scale that determined whether the pattern would continue or falter. The family's survival depended on maintaining this twisted equilibrium, and failure was unthinkable. But nature, as relentless as it is indifferent, always finds a way to push back. Children born into this line sometimes showed rebellion, not the youthful kind, but a deep, existential defiance, as if their bodies themselves were screaming against the inherited patterns. And when that happened, the family responded with secrecy, manipulation, and control, trying desperately to contain the consequences of generations of defiance. Historians and psychologists would call it intergenerational trauma, a cycle of inherited dysfunction that defied explanation. But what makes this family unique, terrifying even, is that they deliberately cultivated it. They understood the risk, yet they persisted. And the stories that survive are chilling. Diaries speak of children who were never allowed to leave, of marriages arranged to preserve bloodlines, of quiet horror that unfolded in bedrooms, kitchens, and living rooms. Nothing escaped scrutiny. Nothing was left to chance. It was as if the family believed that their destiny, their very survival, depended on controlling every aspect of human biology and behavior within their walls. And so, by the fifth generation, what had begun as whispers and subtle oddities became a full-blown legacy of defiance. a chain of secrets, trauma, and obsession that would haunt every member, and eventually anyone who dared to uncover the truth. By the 7th generation, the repercussions of 10 generations of secrecy had created something unrecognizable. What outsiders might have once called a family was now something else entirely, a complex ecosystem of fear, loyalty, and compulsion, where every action was guided by invisible rules written over centuries. The children carried scars both visible and invisible, their eyes reflecting a history they could not fully understand. And still, the family persisted. They adapted, learned, and perfected the art of hiding in plain sight. But for anyone studying the lineage, the patterns could no longer be ignored. The repetition of traits, behaviors, and outcomes became almost mechanical, as if some unseen hand were directing the course of each life. It was as though biology itself had been rewritten, bent to accommodate a singular, obsessive vision of survival. And within this vision, there were moments that chill even the most hardened observer. Births that should have ended in tragedy somehow succeeded. Illnesses that should have been fatal were survived, leaving behind a strange resilience, a genetic stubbornness that bordered on unnatural. And yet, with this survival came an inevitable cost. Mental instability, paranoia, and obsessive tendencies seemed to compound with each generation, echoing the choices of ancestors long dead. The weight of 10 generations is not measured in years or numbers, but in the subtle ways it reshapes the human spirit. And by now, the story had reached a point where ordinary empathy fails, where understanding is replaced by horror. It is difficult to reconcile that these are not fictional horrors, but real lives, real people whose suffering and resilience are intertwined with secrets that no society should tolerate. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is that, for all their efforts to hide it, the family's history was never truly hidden. Letters, photographs, and testimonies remained, waiting for someone curious, or brave, enough to follow the trail. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you obey the rules set by generations before you, or would you fight to break the chain, even knowing the cost? Because in this story, the cost is not theoretical, it is inherited, and each revelation brings with it a mixture of fascination and revulsion, a slow understanding of how far human beings can go when driven by fear, loyalty, and obsession with their own legacy. By the 9th generation, the family had become a study in extremes. Patterns that began as subtle anomalies had now crystallized into unmistakable traits, and the consequences of repeated transgressions were etched into every member of the lineage. Children born at this stage carried both the physical and psychological echoes of a century-long experiment in defiance of nature. There were illnesses no doctor could explain, behaviors that seemed almost predetermined, and an uncanny ability to sense one another's thoughts and intentions, as if the bloodline itself had built a network of instinctual loyalty and suspicion. And yet, for all this, the family still functioned on the surface as though nothing was amiss. The outside world saw nothing but success, tradition, and the mundane routines of small-town life. But inside, every interaction was measured. Every decision weighed against an inherited blueprint that demanded perfection and secrecy. Any deviation was met with subtle but unmistakable consequences. And as the generations progressed, the line between survival and control blurred. It was no longer simply about preserving the family name or bloodline. It was about maintaining a grip on reality itself, a reality shaped by secrets, fear, and an obsession with legacy. The journals from this period reveal a kind of quiet madness. Entries detailing marriages arranged solely to maintain genetic patterns, instructions to suppress certain behaviors in children, and notes on illnesses that may have been preventable if nature had been allowed its course. It is a record not just of human life, but of human manipulation on a scale so intimate and personal that it defies comprehension. And yet, there is an undeniable brilliance in the persistence. The family had learned to survive, to adapt, and to thrive despite biological odds that should have ended their line decades earlier. But survival came at a cost. Each member carried the psychological weight of 10 generations, the inherited memory of choices made in shadow, of desires denied, and of the persistent fear that any mistake could unravel the fragile equilibrium. It is a history that forces you to question not only what it means to be human, but whether the pursuit of legacy can justify the suffering of countless lives. This is the line where fascination meets horror, where curiosity turns to dread, and where the boundaries of morality, biology, and obsession become indistinguishable. The 10th generation arrived as both a culmination and a reckoning. By now, the family's secrets were no longer hidden in diaries or whispers. They were written into the very faces, bodies, and minds of those who carried the bloodline forward. Some members embraced it, seeing themselves as heirs to a dark, twisted legacy, bound by loyalty to ancestors they had never known. Others recoiled, haunted by the echoes of choices made long before their birth, desperate to break the cycle, yet trapped by the weight of inherited expectation. And here lies the cruelest truth. Even rebellion could not erase the past. Nature, society, and morality all intertwined to shape a lineage that had, over 10 generations, defied logic, biology, and human instinct. Outsiders looking in might see only resilience, but those who lived it understood the cost. Lives shadowed by obsession, marriages dictated by pattern rather than passion, children born into a reality they did not choose. It is a cautionary tale in its purest form, one that whispers across time, reminding us that the sins of the past do not remain buried, no matter how carefully they are concealed. And yet, even in this darkness, there is a haunting fascination. To study such a family is to peer into the limits of human endurance, the lengths to which loyalty, fear, and obsession can bend the rules of life itself. Their story leaves you unsettled, not just because of the horrors it reveals, but because it forces a reflection on your own humanity. How far would you go to preserve your lineage? How much could you sacrifice before the cost became unbearable? The answers are unknowable, yet the questions remain, echoing long after the story ends. 10 generations of secrets, 10 generations of defiance, and a single thread that connects them all: the undeniable, haunting proof that human beings are capable of bending life itself to their will, for better or worse. And when you walk away from this story, when the final page is turned and the last photograph is studied in silence, you carry a piece of that horror with you. Because some truths, once uncovered, refuse to be forgotten. They linger in the mind, in the imagination, and in the quiet understanding that sometimes history is darker than anything we are willing to admit. And some families are a warning we can never unsee.